Welcome to FinTrail's FinCrime Spotlight, a mini digest which covers current and topical issues related to financial crime. I'm Ciara and I'm joined today by Jess and Greg Waldowski. In this episode, we discuss the recent European Banking Authority's peer review on how competent authorities authorise payment in e-money institutions under the EBA guidelines under PSD2. So there's a lot to unpack on the report, and we certainly won't be going through all of it today, but we will take a few minutes to walk through some of the key findings in it. Jess, do you want to kick us off? Can you maybe share some of the key highlights from the report?
Sure. I don't even know where to start. It is a huge report, but we'll try and consolidate it. So basically, this report looks at whether competent authorities are actually meeting the EBA guidelines that were set alongside PSD2, the revised version of 2018. So it's basically a cross-checking exercise, peer reviewing, looking to see what everyone is doing, making sure it's aligned and it's meeting those expectations. So there is some good things in there. The report shows that most of the competent authorities have largely implemented those guidelines. There's some consistency, some transparency in there, which is good. Woo, we should all be pleased with that. But some competent authorities haven't implemented the guidelines fully, and they bring those out a lot throughout the report. And some of the really interesting parts as well, they pick out a lot of divergences on the different processes taken by some competent authorities. And we'll dig into this a little bit further, but they look at things like the assessment of business plans, looking at the assessment of governance arrangements, looking at the internal AML control mechanisms that they're assessing, and the different ways that they're doing this diverge across some of the competent authorities. And because of these inconsistencies, it basically means that some firms are kind of forum shopping across some of the different competent authorities in the EU, trying to look for the best authority to go for when they look for their authorization. So basically, the report sets out some of the kind of best practices that different or competent authorities should be doing in order to make sure that there is alignment across the EU and everyone's clear on this. And there are a number of things that people need to be doing over the next couple of years. Some of the basics, all competent authorities need to make sure that applicants have really good 3 lines of defense model, risk management frameworks, have they done an audit, those kind of things. So there's lots of real basic control areas that they're bringing out in this paper. And there's lots of interesting things that our clients need to be aware of when they're looking for authorization. So yeah, lots of things to unpick today, basically.
Great, thanks, Jess. And I think that bit around what clients need to be aware of is probably quite an important bit. And I think one of the points talked about in the report is around the timing of the authorization, and the process can range. I think anything from 4 to, in some cases, 20 plus months. And I think, Greg, on that authorization application point, I know you've had some experience in it. Like, what do you think are some of the key considerations from this that firms should be taking away in terms of an application approach?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Before I drop into that, just to allude something to Jess said, I think there's nothing wrong with shopping around, because different regulators might have different styles and produce, maybe more detailed guidance or be more forward looking and thinking. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think what the EBA is concerned, and I think all of us in the industry are concerned, if some of those differences create a lack of playing field, meaning that you could skip some of the things and get access to the financial market, whilst your application was not assessed to the same standards as with any other jurisdiction. I think that is the concern. But firms looking for the right jurisdiction to settle, I think we all agree there's nothing wrong with that. And with looking at the timing of authorization, you're rightly in saying that the report highlights that on average is between 4 and 6, but it could be 20 months or more. Again, with those reports, the detail is the devil is in detail, as they say. And I think the jurisdiction which they highlight as example of 20 plus is a little bit of a red herring. The reason for that particular jurisdiction is that the approach to authorization is, rather than reject, they would allow the applicants to make the changes and carry on with the same process, rather than, as in some other jurisdiction, you kick out of the process and you go back to the end of the queue. So as with any report, look into the fine details before you make up your mind and settle on the right jurisdiction. I think what is also interesting, and definitely firms should take a notice, is not only about the length of the process, is also there are some good insights from various competent authorities about what they see as a very common mistakes made by the firms. They talk about generic applications, the generic documentation. They talk about firms not taking enough time and effort putting into those applications. And we've seen that through our work with FinTrail, as well as maybe our previous engagement, that the firms who try and just take a chance with the application, they never progress, and then from day one they they create a very bad reputation for themselves with the regulator, and then they need to work twice or three times as hard to convince the regulator that they really should be allowed to operate in specific jurisdiction. So some very interesting insights there. And in comparison to UK, for example, so although obviously this report focuses on PSD2, so it focuses on the electronic money institutions and approved payment institutions. When it comes to quality of application, probably there was no difference if you look at some of the recent statement from Emily Shepard's speech, when she was talking about the VASP application in the UK, and she said that they considered only 5% of applicants actually placed a good quality application, with the rest being either not meeting standards or being totally unacceptable. So something to really for the firms to think about, that they should not take it lightly. They really need to put the time and effort.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually, on how to make sure that you've got a really good quality application. I think we speak to our clients a lot when we sort of support them through this process, is making sure that you get engagement with the regulator really early on. And that's something that is brought out in the report as well, that it's really key to get sort of pre-application meetings in, so that the authority can start to understand what you're going to be applying for, what your application looks like, what sort of initial feedback can you get from them at that stage, to try and identify some of the potential issues at that early stage before you submit that formal application. And that's something that we talk about many times with different prospective applicants when they're looking to engage. Really make sure you got that engagement early on.
Yeah, even those, again, don't take your chances. Sorry.
Yes,
yeah.
Don't take your chances. We've seen that many times. For example, firms going into that first engagement, without even having anyone in charge of the AML role, and that very easily is picked up by regulator as a sign of not treating that application seriously enough. And those are very low-hanging fruits where firms are really shooting themselves in the foot, right, by not making that time and effort.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that sort of the attention to detail and the preparedness of that is quite a key thing. And I think, Jess, I'll come to you now, because I know the report itself focuses on the competent authorities' scrutiny on applicants, their AML CTF internal control framework. And I think there's quite a few pages covering some of the theme gaps that they've identified. Do you want to maybe talk us through some of the things that they're seeing across a number of the jurisdictions?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and summarize this quite quickly, because there were a number of themes that came out. So the first one is really looking at incomplete documentation. So incomplete AML CFT documents being submitted. And then also the competent authorities not necessarily having the right technical expertise to assess, check, verify whether or not those documents are actually sufficient to be able to go through the authorization process. So within authorities, they kind of saw that their teams lacked that experience. Maybe they need to go out to other departments to look for the right expertise to review these documents. But also from the applicant themselves, those documents not being complete. So when we're dealing with some of our clients, we're making sure, have you actually got those documents ready? I mean, Greg said this is another low-hanging fruit here. Are those documents complete, and are they sufficient, and are they good to go through that process? But on top of that, another really interesting one to be aware of, and it's a key control failing actually when we talk to a lot of our clients, is really looking at their firm-wide risk assessment for financial crime. And this report picks up on competent authorities not necessarily having the right methodology to assess whether or not this risk assessment is actually sufficient and appropriate to the level of risk within that applicant. I mean, they gave a couple of examples, like Norway just having a basic checklist to make sure that this is kind of okay for the authorization process. But ultimately, this creates a really challenging situation where the applicant is submitting something that the competent authority doesn't necessarily know how to verify. And it sort of makes the process very, very difficult to go through. So a lot of the things that the report suggests is competent authorities putting together a clear set of criteria and hopefully a little bit more guidance so that when firms do create those risk assessments for the authorization, they've got a bit more clear direction as to what they're putting together. And on top of that, very similarly, having no real clear methodology or criteria to assess the wider control framework, so the systems and controls that are in place to prevent financial crime. So again, a number of different competent authorities didn't really have the right methodology to assess whether or not they were sufficient. Number of applicants didn't really have a clear picture of what their framework might be. It might change, those kind of things. But again, the report recommended that these competent authorities just get a clear framework in place to make sure that they assess these, and it's transparent and it's the same across a number of authorities. And then the final one that was really interesting as well, and again goes back to Greg's point on making sure that you have a person responsible for your AML CFT framework. So that designated person that's responsible for managing sort of financial crime risk, the competent authorities need to make sure that they have a suitable level of expertise to be able to do that job. But a lot of the competent authorities are actually assessing this in a very varied and different way. So some of them was, or even at all, literally a couple of them not really assessing at all. So some might check a CV, some might just check their diploma. Some do some element of suitability testing, but others do not. So there's a number of different things that they're trying to check here. And that's a key one, making sure that, you know, the firm's person that's responsible for this role can actually do that role.
And there are also, so the report itself obviously looks at some of those failings or looks at some of those areas where competent authorities might not fully implement the guidance, but it also highlights some good practices. And again, maybe this is something what firms can focus on to see, you know, which of those jurisdictions do follow some of those best practices. And one of those they mentioned is obviously this pre-screening meeting where you've got opportunity to early engage with regulator to explain, you know, roughly your business model and to get some initial thoughts from the regulator. There is it is deployed in different ways by different regulators. Some actually see it as a mandatory part of the process, so you need to pass this first before you can go any further. So some of them are very proactive, actually inviting firms. Others do it from time to time. Whereas in other jurisdictions, there will be no direct kind of communication with the regulators before you place your application. And then even the feedback on application, that also varies. And what's interesting to see how different regulators see the role. Some of them see the role as a guide through the process and working very closely with the firms and supporting them in that process. Whilst others are much more stricter, saying we are the regulators, we're not here to handhold you, cotton wool you, you know, you do your homework, you do the heavy lifting, send this over to us, and we say whether that cuts master or not. Again, something I think very important for firms to take into consideration as and when you are.
Another area of best practice as well is when they're looking to verify or assess the suitability of that person in charge, looking as part of that process to actually interview them and talk to them to make sure that they are actually suitable for that and have the sufficient expertise to be able to do that role. And as Greg said, some do, some don't. And it's just putting these best practice guides in place and making sure that there's a bit of kind of alignment between the authorities.
Well, hopefully some of the adoption of these best practices and the recommendations within the report will drive up that consistency of approach, and we'll introduce forum shopping for the right reasons, necessarily than the wrong reasons. So before we close off, actually then, Greg, just one area to touch on, and we chatted about it earlier, was around what the report highlights about local substance, which I think is an important part to reference for anyone listening in on this before we conclude.
Definitely. I found that part especially interesting because, one of the reasons the PSD2 being brought in, and one of the reasons why EBA got enormous work with various regulators is to ensure that the regulators are able to appropriately supervise the firms. And that might be difficult if the firm you're regulating is not actually based in your jurisdiction. And we've seen some of those examples, even when it comes to prosecution, right? In those, the individuals whose failing are being investigated beyond the reach of regulators, and not necessarily might have the same leverage as US authorities to follow that up. And I thought that we get to the point in Europe, and maybe I was naive, that in most of the jurisdiction it is quite proactively enforced that, in order to be regulated, you do need your head office to be based in the country, and you need at least part of your services to be provided in that jurisdiction. That is not necessarily still the case. And again, the regulators take a different view. Sometimes that could be influenced by some specific local regulations where maybe there is no differentiation between what does it mean to be based, what does it mean the head office needs to be based versus the registered office to be based, and so on. And that's also something which I believe is debated here in the UK. So for those who do like spending time reading through consultation and so on, the topic of the local requirements also has been raised by the payment regulation and the systematic perimeter consultation, which came out last July. We're still waiting for the final outcome. And this is something which also, we're looking at in the UK. So in general, FCA expect APIs, EMIs to have a head office in the UK and operations in the UK and so on. But there are still, you can still also operate via the branch. And then in that particular scenario, your head office might not necessarily be based in the UK. So the UK government is keen to understand, and it would be interesting to see how that's going to evolve moving forward. But now we're kind of slipping into another huge
yeah, that's another spotlight for another day. Well, on that note, I think we've actually covered quite a lot today, and I think the report is definitely worth a read for anyone who's looking to expand into different jurisdictions across the market. So please do take a look. But thanks, Jess and Greg, for your time today, and to everyone watching FinTrail FinCrime Spotlight. Bye.